Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're on section 305.3. We had just finished all of the definitions. As you can see, 305.3 is specific requirements that was included in the 2012 code for daycare centers and educational occupancies, second grade and lower. Those same code requirements were brought forward. These are Houston amendments only, and they were brought forward into the 2015 code with no changes. Let's go down to the next Houston amendment, uses and other group H. IBC code model was updated, and the list of code provisions identified in this section of the 2012 IBC relocated to section 307.1.1 of the 15 code. The code provisions of the 2012 IBC section 307.1 and the Houston amendments are now located in 2015 IBC section 307.1.1. So although it's been relocated to a different section, the code requirements are the same. There's no changes to the previous amendment or the code intent. Go down to the next Houston amendment. Section 307.1.2 for hazardous materials includes an exception that is a Houston amendment. The previous Houston amendment was brought forward, and the only changes are updates to the sections in the 2015 code to make sure that you're getting to the right section. So there's no change to the previous technical requirements or technical code intent. Again, there's a section now 307.1.3 that talks about hazardous enterprise permits, and basically businesses and facilities storing or utilizing hazardous materials exceeding the maximum allowed quantities identified in tables 307.1, parentheses 1 and parentheses 2 shall comply with chapter 28 for hazardous enterprise. Section 308.3 institutional group I1. City of Houston includes an amendment to this ICC modified code provision in the 2015 IBC. The Houston amendment was established by the City Legal Department to clearly define the application of these code provisions. Modification and Houston clarification, the uses permitted in a Group I1 custodial care facility have been expanded to include care recipients who may need a limited degree of verbal and physical assistance if responding to a fire or other emergency situation. This Houston amendment was added to include in this section to more clearly identify when a Group I1 occupancy classification is assigned to a facility where specific parameters and services are provided. The clarification intended by this amendment was established in coordination with the City Legal Department. Let's see, it sounded like somebody might be waiting to get brought back in. I don't see it. Okay. Let's go to the next one. The previous City of Houston amendment was of section 308.4 was not brought forward. Although no amendment is provided for this section, it is a change from the previous City of Houston code requirements. In addition, ICC modified these code provisions to include specific conditions of use. This is a modification on two basic conditions of Group I2 medical care use that have previously been regulated together as a single category have been created, dividing the classification into short-term care facilities such as hospitals and long-term care facilities such as nursing homes. Again, the specific requirements associated with daycare and educational occupancies that shall not allow children of second grade or lower above the level of exit discharge are also included in section 308.6.5. This is not a change from the previous code, and everyone would want to be aware of this if you're doing any kind of educational occupancy or an occupancy with daycare or second graders and lower on an upper level floor. Because essentially what it requires is for them particular individuals to have separate means of egress. Section 312.1 includes a Houston amendment. The existing amendment was modified to correlate with the permit exemptions for fences 8 feet in height or less. Again, 312.2 fences. The previous City Houston amendment was modified to include specific fencing requirements specified in the city code for barbed wire and electrically charged fences. So now the requirements associated with those particular fences that are identified in the city code are actually included in section 312.2, which is titled fences. There was a new table that was created for care facility classifications in section 310.1, and it was also titled table 313.1. I'm sorry, 313.1. This particular table was created several code cycles back. We were trying to reintroduce it into the building code to try to see if it can help customers better classify their care facilities, but it doesn't override. This table does not override the specific requirements of the code sections. It's just a table, and it's general in nature, and part of the code requirements, if you read through this section, it will tell you that adult and child care facility shall be classified in accordance with tables 3, 13.1, 313.2, and sections 305, 308, 310 as applicable. Note, the following tables are general requirements and are subordinate to the specific provisions of applicable code sections. So the sections would overrule this table if there was ever found to be a conflict in it. And we would, if you do happen to find something that you don't think matches with the code sections, please let us know, and we'll definitely get it updated so that it more clearly matches. We're trying to make things a little easier, but with all the different types of facilities now, I'm not sure if that table is going to work. Section 403.5.3.1 stairway communication systems. The City of Houston amendment was added to the building code to clarify needed signage for building owners and occupant expectations to address fire code requirements during the building design phase of construction. So essentially, we're putting this pointer to the requirements for stairway communication system reentry signage instead of letting the builders find out about it after the fire marshal goes out there. We want to make sure that you know about it during the plan review phase of construction and permitting. There's a new section for stairway reentry doors, which says the stairway reentry door in exit enclosures shall be provided on every 5th floor level as well as the top occupied floor level. Reentry stairway doors shall be located on the same floor as each approved communication system in accordance with 403.531. It was added to the building code to clarify needed signage for building owners and occupant expectations to address fire code requirements during the building design phase of construction, to make it clear that these stairway reentry doors are required at every 5th floor level and the top floor, regardless of where that top floor falls. a re-entry door is always required at the top level. In this section, 406.3.4 separations, the previous City of Houston amendment was carried over to the 2015. ICC reorganized the text of this section to coordinate with changes in other I codes. This section now includes a subsection to specifically address dwelling unit separation from the garage it is attached to. The previous City of Houston amendment is relocated to the end of the newly formatted section 406.341. And the City of Houston amendment has to do with the attic disappearing stairs, and it goes into it's exactly the same as it was before. Tells what the stairs have to be made out of if you're going to have attic disappearing stairs at this location. Garage screening is a Houston amendment that is introduced into the building code through the city ordinance. That city ordinance requirement was brought forward into the IBC again this year without change, no changes at all. In section 406.9, repair garages for natural gas and hydrogen fueled vehicles. This is a new section that was added to chapter 4 for special occupancy groups. And it was added to the building code to correlate with the ventilation requirements specified in section 2311.7.1 of the 2015 International Fire Code. The 2015 Fire Code specifically has this requirement, and we wanted just to make sure that the building code is correlated with the fire code requirements so that you know about this before you get out into the field with something and then find out from the fire marshal that you have to comply with this particular section. We want to make sure that it's in the building code requirements so you know about it up front. Let's go down to the next. Let's see. Section 412.8.3 means of egress in heliports and helistops. This previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward. Minor editorial change, but no change to the technical requirements or code intent. Same applies to section 413.1, fire apparatus access roads for high pile stock or rack storage. There's no change to the Houston requirements. Section 414.1.4 titled tire disposers, chipping and shredding operations, screening of property. This new City of Houston amendment was added for tire disposers, chipping and shredding operations to correlate with the Houston Fire Code and LSB standards. This is just another section that was added to the Houston Building Code to correlate with the Houston Fire Code requirements so that designers know about this requirement up front before they get something built in the field, and then the fire marshal comes out there and shows you in his book and his life safety bureau standards that this has to be done. Section 414.6 outdoor storage, dispensing and use. Again, this is a section that refers back to chapter 28, article 7 of the city code, which is the hazardous enterprise ordinance. The new City of Houston amendment added as a pointer to the city code and the updated requirements of the hazardous enterprise ordinance. The exception is intended to identify that the stricter requirements of the ordinance will govern any facility exceeding the MAQs of stored hazardous materials identified in the tables of the building and fire codes for indoor storage, including those facilities with or without weather protection canopies. So again, if you're storing hazardous materials on site and those materials, the quantity of those materials exceed the limits, the MAQs identified for indoor storage, the ordinance applies and you have to get a hazardous enterprise permit. So this is a change to the hazardous enterprise ordinance that happened about 4 or 5 months back. It was updated due to an explosion that happened close to downtown here, where literally hundreds of homes were blown off of their foundation. So 415.2, it talks about definitions for HPM flammable liquids. These definitions have been relocated to Chapter 2 of the codes. There's no change to the code requirements or code intent. 421.5, exhaust ventilation for hydrogen fuel gas rooms now has a specific requirement that refers to Section 2307.1 of the Fire Code. Get you guys to the right section in the Fire Code so that it's not missed. Electrical systems, there's a Section 422.6. City of Houston Amendment was added, and it has to do with in ambulatory care facilities, the essential electrical systems for electrical components, equipment, and systems shall be designed and constructed in accordance with the provisions of Chapter 27 and NFPA 99. And I think that's the generator requirements. I need to put that in there. Cover ambulatory care facilities. I'm almost positive that's the generator requirements, but I'll have to update that reference to make sure it's identifying what that Chapter 27 is referring to. I think you probably already noticed that there's some of these rows that have light blue, as I said before. These are significant changes that were made to the base or the model codes, but they don't include any Houston amendments, so we're bypassing those for now. Section 427 has to do with reuse of building materials, and there's an Appendix R in the current IBC that does allow the reuse of building materials without having to get special approval from the building official. There's no change to the previous code amendments or code intent. Section 428 has to do with energy systems, and those systems shall be installed in accordance with NFPA 70, which is the NEC, NFPA 111, and NFPA 855, and the most restrictive provisions specified in the most current edition of the international codes. Energy systems. So in the IFC, there was an entire new chapter added to the fire code, Chapter 12, that deal with energy system installations. That particular chapter was brought backward from the 2018 code and added to the 2015 code to address those specific energy systems that we're seeing in the plans more and more often, because the 15 and the 12 codes didn't really have specific code requirements to address those types of installations. So now we do with the Houston Amendment that added Chapter 12 to the fire code. Section 429 have to do with mobile food units and other mobile food preparation vehicles. The new City of Houston Amendment addressing these mobile food units and their requirements identified in 319 of Chapter 20 of the City Code. So basically, it's just a pointer to get you to the right place in the City Code so that you don't miss something that might be important for these types of mobile food units. Houston Building Code Chapter 5, General Building Heights and Areas. In 501.2, amendment was modified by the city legal to include editorial correct changes meeting city legal specifications. There's no change to the previous technical code requirements or code intent to this section. It basically is just requiring an identifying address at the site. Those are, the location and everything is typically worked out through the fire marshal's office as a general rule. Let's see. Okay, required separation of occupancies. There was a previous City Houston amendment that added a footnote to this table. The previous footnote amendment was brought forward in the 2015 code and renumbered due to another new ICC added footnote. So the code requirements are the same. It doesn't change. It has to do with, the amendment has to do with daycare facilities shall be separated from assembly areas where alcohol is served. That's been in the code as long as I've been here, and we're just bringing that forward to provide additional protection for daycare facilities. There was a previous City Houston amendment to section 510.1 that was brought forward. There's no change to the code requirements or code intent. The amendment's exactly the same as it was before. Another City Houston amendment for basement and first story of open parking garage. There was the previous City Houston amendment was brought forward with no changes whatsoever. No change to the intent or code requirements. Section 511, transit sheds. The previous City Houston amendment was brought forward. The only change is the City Legal Department wanted a title to proceed or to be after the section number, so they added the word scope. Foundation elevation in section 512. The previous City Houston amendment was brought forward with no changes whatsoever. Same thing applies to 512.2 for plans and application, 512.3 damage risk, 512.4 existing structures. The previous City Houston amendments were brought forward with no changes whatsoever. Allowable materials. This is an addition. There was an addition by ICC. Walls of a freezer and coolers located in buildings of type 1 and 2 construction may now be constructed of wood materials provided 3 conditions are met. 1, the cooler freezer is a maximum of 1,000 square feet. 2, lined on both sides with non-combustible materials. And 3, the building has fire sprinklers. The previous City of Houston amendment is brought forward, and an additional minor change correlates item 25 with the mechanical code. There's no change to the previous technical code requirements by the City of Houston amendment, but of course, it looks like ICC added this additional item 26, which does provide some exceptions for smaller freezers and coolers. So we're jumping, it looks like, to chapter 7. Come on, get down there. 714.1.1 ducts and air transfer openings. The previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward. Some minor editorial changes that added the metric equivalents to the numbers that were referenced in items 3 and 4. There's no change to the technical code requirements to this section. Same thing applies to access and identification of smoke and fire dampers. The previous City of Houston amendments was brought forward with no change to the code requirements. Combustible materials in concealed spaces. There was no City of Houston amendment in 2012 code. There was some minor editorial changes in 718.5 of the 2015 code. Just to be more clear, it's a clarity issue. City Legal eliminated the term international in front of the mechanical code, and we added point 2, the subsection, or to be more specific, instead of just referencing to section 602, we're referencing to section 602.2 to get you exactly where you need to be if you're doing this particular item. Chapter 9, the previous City of Houston amendment to 901.1 scope, which includes and the fire code, was brought forward. No other changes to that section. Threads, 901.4, which identified the national standard host threads as the approved standard hose threads for the city of Houston. It was brought forward with no changes. Acceptance testing in 901.5, there was a previous City of Houston amendment. That entire City of Houston amendment was brought forward with no change to the amendment. Same thing with 901.6.2 for fire alarms. There was a previous City of Houston amendment that eliminated some of the text out of this particular section. That text was brought forward, or that a Houston amendment was brought forward. No change at all. In 901.6 for fire pumps, there's a minor change. It was the Houston amendment was amended during the public comment period by a submission from Mr. Hicks with ICC. With CIC. The previous City Houston amendment was rearranged to provide a clear understanding of the code requirements and to identify that sizing of the brake tank shall be established as required by NFPA 20 where a larger size is needed. There's no change to the previous code requirements or code intent. It's just been reworded a little bit to be more clear. Outside sprinkler control valves was a previous City of Houston amendment that was brought forward and added to 901.10 in the same place, no changes whatsoever. So the outside control of the sprinkler control valve is still required, the same as it was before. Two-way standpipe connections for Class 1 and Class 3 standpipe systems. They have to be equipped with a two-way fire department inlet connection. The previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward with no changes whatsoever. Same thing applies to the fire department connections of 901.12. Those previous City of Houston amendments for fire department connection was brought forward without any changes. Section 903.2, where required, approved automatic sprinkler systems in new buildings and structures shall be provided in the locations described. And the previous City of Houston amendment, which added a second exception, which says in other than H occupancies, a sprinkler system shall not be required in open buildings. That same Houston amendment was brought forward into the 2015. In 903.2.1.1, Group A occupancies, this particular section now has an exception to it that basically says in lieu of sprinkler system for a temporary use, the applicant may agree to provide a fire watch. So essentially we took the fire watch requirements out of the fire code and added them to the building code for certain occupancy groups under the sprinkler requirements as an exception. That is done in Group A1, Group A2, Group A3, A4, A5, and assembly occupancies of roofs. The same thing is allowed for those particular occupancy groups. In section 903.2.5 Group H, automatic sprinkler systems shall be provided in high hazard occupancies as required by sections 903.2.5.1 through 903.2.5.3. But there is this exception that the City of Houston added as a Houston amendment that says hazardous materials storage canopies complying with the provisions of section 414.6.1 are for weather protection are exempt from this particular item. Let's see. The previous City of Houston amendment that was in group in 903.2.8 Group R, automatic sprinkler systems installed in accordance with section 903.3 shall be provided throughout all buildings with a Group R fire area. The City of Houston added an exception in the previous code, and that exception was brought forward into the 2015 code. And this is based on a state law that prohibits cities from requiring fire sprinklers in 1- and 2-family dwellings. Let's see, exempt locations. The previous City of Houston amendment that was provided in section 903.3.1.1.1 has not changed. It was brought forward exactly as it was before, so there's no change to the technical code requirements for automatic sprinklers for this particular item. Go to the next Houston amendment. Commercial hood and duct systems. There's a new City of Houston amendment that was added to section 904.2.2, which basically says each required commercial kitchen exhaust hood and duct system required by section 609 of the fire code or section 508.1 of the mechanical code to have a type 1 hood shall be protected with an automatic sprinkler fire extinguishing system in accordance with this code. So this is a minor change to this section to be more clear and get you to the correct section instead of just leading you to a chapter. We actually are getting you to the section that applies. Same thing in section 904.12. There was a Houston amendment added to specify the exact section rather than utilizing the model code requirement, because the Houston amendment sends you to a correct City of Houston amendment section that you need to get to, and not the model code section that is does not apply in this case because it got renumbered. Let's see the next section. There was a previous City of Houston amendment in 905.3.1 for titled height for class standpipe system. There was some text stricken out of the previous code. That text was brought, or that amendment was brought forward, and the same text is stricken out of the current code. There's no changes to the code requirements for that section or the next section. For Group A, in 905.3.2, there was a previous Houston amendment that deleted exception number 2, which allowed class 1 automatic dry and semi-automatic dry standpipes or manual wet dry standpipes. The City of Houston doesn't allow dry standpipes, so the fire marshals requested this particular change. And for section 905.3.4 stages, previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward. No change to the code requirements. In fact, there was a previous text that was stricken out of the 2012 that is no longer strict. So you can use a class 3 wet standpipe system with 1.5 and 2.5 inch hose connections on each side of the stage. That's the code requirement for that. In section 905.4, location of class 1 standpipe hose connections, there's a Houston amendment now. The new amendment accepted during the public comment period and submitted again by Mr. Hicks, which requires the stairway standpipe hose connections to be located on the main floor level within the stair enclosure instead of the intermediate floor level. This is more in line with the model codes throughout the nation, and the fire marshals was okay with it, so it was approved. And as I was saying earlier, section 905.8 dry standpipes, the model code allows an exception for dry standpipes, but the City of Houston frowns on dry standpipes, so because of the equipment they have, they don't allow dry standpipes, so it's basically prohibited. So right now the code says dry standpipe shall not be installed, no exceptions. That's the same as it was in the previous code. Section 905.11, design pressures. The previous City of Houston amendment of 35 PSI uppermost, the design pressure at the uppermost valve for a class 2 standpipe system shall be 35 PSI. That same requirement is still in the code in section 905.11. No change to the code requirements. Section 906.2 of the 2015 code now includes an additional City of Houston amendment that was added as a pointer to the Houston Fire Department's Life Safety Bureau Standard 1. And there's a previous City of Houston amendment in section 907.2 where required new buildings and structures have to have a fire alarm. There's a third exception that was in that previous section as a Houston amendment. We brought that forward in the current code. So now the third exception says, and other than Group H occupancy, fire alarm shall not be required in open buildings. Back to the open buildings. Section 907.2.2 for building Group B, the fire alarms. There's a City of Houston amendment, a previous City of Houston amendment that was brought forward. No changes. That allows an exception that says in other than high-rise buildings, manual fire alarm boxes are not required. There's no change to the previous City of Houston amendment or code intent. In section 907.2.3 for Group E, there is a Houston amendment that says a manual and automatic fire alarm system that indicates the occupant notification signaling utilizing an emergency voice alarm communication system meeting the requirements of 907.5.2.2 shall be installed. Oh my gosh, we're not going to get through this. There's no way I can, let's see, finish this in the amount of time that I got allotted for me. Got another 30 minutes. Let's see. Previous City of Houston amendment for Group E occupancies for smoke detectors was brought forward. No changes other than the exception says, now it says that you have to have fire marshal approval to meet the exception. So if the fire marshal agrees that you don't need approved heat detectors, then you would not have to do them. But you have to get his approval. In section 907.232, Group E, childcare with occupant load of 30 or more. That particular title is no longer in the Houston amendment. It was modified. Now it's titled Group E daycare facilities. And the new amendment basically says unless a fire alarm system is provided, meeting the requirements of 907.2.3, a smoke alarm shall be provided in each occupied area of child daycare facilities with an occupant load of less than 30. Where more than one smoke alarm is required, the smoke alarm shall be interconnected in such a manner that activation of one alarm shall activate all alarms. In section 907.2.3.3 smoke detectors, the distance between smoke detectors shall not exceed a nominal spacing of 30 feet. And there shall be detectors within a distance of 1/2 the nominal spacing measured at right angles from all walls and partitions extending upward to within the top 15% of the ceiling height. So this amendment was modified to give approval power for this type of smoke detector installation to the fire marshal. So if you run across a situation where you think it's an application that you can use for your particular daycare center, then you want to get with the fire marshal and see if he can would allow this. In 907.2.3, the City of Houston amendment was omitted for application of model code requirements found in this same section. So the previous City of Houston amendment basically allowed manual fire alarm boxes where required in Group E occupancy. Manual fire alarm boxes shall be located in accordance with 907.3. Now the code says Group E, a manual and automatic fire alarm system that initiates the occupant notification signal shall be installed. They don't want to, apparently the fire marshals don't want to rely 100% on a manual pull station for the alarm. So if the smoke detectors go off, they want everybody to know about it and so they can get the children out. In section 907.2.6.4, there was a previous City of Houston amendment that was brought forward for Group I4 occupancies to have a manual fire alarm and an automatic fire detection system installed in accordance with 907.2.3. Those requirements have not changed and remain the same. Same thing goes for section 907.2.11.8, Group E, child care facilities. The previous City of Houston amendment was relocated from 907.2.11.3 to 2.11.8. And there's no change to the code requirements or code intent from the previous code requirements. So what was required before is still required, no change. The same thing applies to emergency voice alarm communication systems of 907.5.2.2. The previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward and to the same section with no changes whatsoever. And the only amendment to that section is that the alarms that go off shall not sound in elevator groups or exit stairs because it creates confusion, and we don't want to do that for those people that have entered those areas because they're trying to get out of a building in a bad situation. In section 909.12.2, wiring, the previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward into the new code, and there's no change to those code requirements or code intent. So in addition to meeting the requirements of the electrical code, mechanical smoke control wiring, regardless of voltage, shall be fully enclosed within continuous raceways. The requirement of this section shall apply only to wiring extending from the fire alarm system control unit that activates any required smoke control system components such as relays, fans, dampers, or stair pressurization system. Section 909.13.1, materials control air tubing shall be hard drawn copper. There was a previous City of Houston amendment. It's a minor change that just modified the text of exception number 1 to be more specific and point to the correct code section instead of the one that was identified in the model code. That's the only amendment that got brought forward. Section 909.20, smoke-proof enclosures. There was a previous City of Houston amendment that was just minor in nature. It specifically identified the section where access to the roof is required by section 1009.16.1. The International Model Code changes to provide clarity. Previous amendment is not carried forward as the new updated 2015 code addresses everything sufficiently. So it's pointing to the correct place. Let's see. Location and access. Rated construction reduced to 1 hour. And previous section 911.1.1, location and access. The location and accessibility of the Fire Command Center shall be approved by the fire code official. The previous code requirements required the access to that Fire Command Center through a 2-hour rated corridor. That is no longer required. The base code only requires 1 hour, and the City of Houston brought a Houston amendment to this section that basically mirrors what's in the model fire code. So only 1 hour fire rated corridor leading directly to the exterior has to be provided now. Let's see. Section 911.1.2 is the separation of the fire command center from the rest of the building, and that used to also be 2 hour. Now it's only 1 hour. It's in the model code. Required features. The fire command center shall comply with NFPA 72 and shall contain the following features. Houston amendments added items 19 and 20 to the list of items that you have to comply with, and those previous City Houston amendments was brought forward into the 15 code. So the same two items have been brought forward. And basically it means that a means, item 19 is a means to automatically switch an alarm signal to an approved central station. Item 20 is 2 headsets per each 10 stories in building height is required. Chapter 10, I can tell you right now, Chapter 10 was extensively updated in the 2015 code. There's a lot of changes to the model code in Chapter 10. In Section 1001.1, there is a Houston amendment that was added, new amendment addressing minimum code provisions for construction of certain building elements that may resemble components of a means of egress system, but may not be part of a required means of egress. Clear guidance is needed in the code to identify minimum construction requirements for such building elements. So essentially, there's a new subsection to the general requirements that addresses accessory stairs, ramps, doors, and landings. Basically, this new code section says that unless specifically addressed in the code, accessory stairs, ramps, doors, and landings that are not components of a means of egress system shall meet the appropriate provisions of this code for the application and scope of work proposed, as if they are components of a means of egress system. What that means is if you have a stair or a ramp or a landing that you're trying to construct out in the field, it has to meet the same construction requirements as any other stair or ramp or landing. It has to meet the loading requirements, the construction requirements. Everything is the same as if it was an egress stair. 7-Eleven, rise and run, that kind of stuff. Handrails required, yes. An accessory stair being constructed properly is just as important as a means of egress stair. We don't want anybody getting hurt. There's a new City Houston amendment to section 1001.3, maintenance. Means of egress shall be maintained in accordance with section 1031 of the fire code. And again, we were talking about that earlier. The fire code has always typically been thought of as a maintenance code. Even though there is a property maintenance code, we don't adopt that book, and the fire code would still be applicable even if we did. Let's see, previous City Houston amendment of section 10003.3, protruding objects, is not carried forward. That previous Houston amendment basically deleted the entire section and reserved it. So now protruding objects are in the code. You're going to want to be careful if you're constructing egress paths that may have protruding objects in it. Make sure you meet the headroom requirements, the post-mounted objects, horizontal projections. Just be aware that this section is in the code now. Your accessibility standards, basically this reflects what the accessibility standards are also, because you don't want somebody who might be impaired walking into something that's projecting out into a walk path. Elevators, escalators, and moving walks. The previous City of Houston amendment was not carried forward. It deleted an exception, elevators used as accessible means of egress in accordance with section 1007.4. In the new section, in the new 2015 code, that exception is referring to 1009.4, but basically the exception is in the code. We didn't have a good justification for eliminating it. Get to the next Houston amendment. There it is. In the previous 2012 code, the entire section 1007 was deleted. The problem with that deletion was even though that section is titled accessible means of egress, the section itself dealt a lot with exit discharge requirements. And by deleting that entire section, the exit discharge requirements got deleted. And that's a problem. So this time, there was no good justification for deleting that, even though we don't check accessibility requirements. We do check for the third part of the means of egress system, which is the exit discharge. So that has to be part of the means of egress. Otherwise, you do not have a complete means of egress. So just be aware that section 1007 exit and exit access doorway configuration is in the code, because I guess the International Code Council agreed with someone that it was titled incorrectly also. So they retitled this section to exit and exit access doorway configuration. Let's go down to the next section. Thresholds. The previous City of Houston amendment was not carried forward. In section 10008.1.7 thresholds, there was 2 items in the list of 3 that was deleted. There was no real justification for deleting those items, even though both of them deal with accessibility. The City of Houston does not review accessibility requirements. That's reflected in Chapter 11 with some editorial notes. So even though these 2 sections refer to Chapter 11, once you get there, it's irrelevant, because that entire chapter, I believe, gets deleted, or there's an editorial note that says it's not adopted. Let's see, there was a previous City of Houston amendment for door arrangement that struck some text that had more to do with accessibility. That amendment is no longer deleted. So there's no change to the code requirements because we do not review accessibility. Locks and latches. There was a previous item 6 that was a City of Houston amendment. That amendment was not brought forward in the new code or in the 2015 amendments. So it reverts, the code requirements reverts back to the model code. Same thing in the next section for bolt locks. There was a previous City of Houston amendment that was not brought forward. Let's see. The bolt lock, so that basically means although there is no Houston amendment, it reverts back to the model code, and that sixth item is no longer part of the code. The sixth item for under boat locks was in buildings in occupancy group B that have an occupant load of 10 or less, doors may be equipped with a manually operated deadbolt in addition to a door latch. These code requirements are already built into exceptions into the code, so there was no reason to add a second or third Houston amendment, because we were just duplicating what was already in the code. There's a City of Houston amendment to sensor release of electronically locked egress doors. Numerous revisions throughout the locking provisions now help clarify requirements and their application through the use of consistent terminology. This new City of Houston amendment includes updates to the IBC from the 2018 edition to provide more options based on new technology for e-lock door hardware. Change requested by the occupancy group. So there was a City of Houston amendment added to section 1010.1.9.8 that now allows some additional options for designers. One of them says the sensors release for electronically locked device electronically locks on sensors release doors located in a means of egress in any occupancy except group H are permitted where installed and operated in accordance with all the following criteria. So instead of having just some of the occupancies as identified in this section, the City of Houston is allowing the use of these items in any occupancy except a group H. Same thing applies in section 1010.1.9.9. The model code specifically called out certain occupancy groups. The City of Houston changed it to any occupancy except group H. So if you comply with these requirements specified in the model code, you can use them in any occupancy group except group H. So there's a new Houston amendment, section 1010.1.9.12, controlled egress doors from elevator lobbies. This is a new City of Houston amendment allowing electronic locking devices on elevator lobby doors. And basically the exit doors and the means of egress in buildings that are equipped throughout with an automatic sprinkler system in accordance with NFPA 13 or an approved automatic smoke and heat detection system installed in accordance with 907 shall be permitted to be locked from the egress side with an electronic locking system. Talking about your e-locks or your mag locks. The locking system shall be installed and operated in accordance with all the following. The door lock shall unlock on actuation of an automatic sprinkler. The door lock shall unlock on loss of power. The lock is controlled by a relay. Removal of power from the relay or any failure of wiring other device in the circuit to the lock shall cause the lock to unlock or fail open. The door lock shall be capable of being unlocked upon a signal from the Fire Command Center. The door lock shall unlock without delay with an emergency release device, direct inline power interrupting switch, such as a manual fire alarm box or the egress on the egress side. Resettable only by manual use of a key. A sign shall be provided adjacent to the door. Basically, the previous electronic lock requirements have now been added to the code in this code section so that it's spelled out what you can do and how you can utilize electronic locks in addition to those that are already in the building code. A new section 1010.2.2 security gates allowing electronic locking device is now been added to the code. So in locations other than on doors where panic hardware is required, security gates may be installed provided they remain open when the premises is occupied by anyone other than the security personnel. New City Houston Amendment, editorial, no. Portions of not shown shall remain the same. So in section 10, 11, 16, ladders, item 6, the model code reference to 3065 was changed to section 304.3.1.2 of the International Mechanical Code due to changes in that code. So we had to correlate this particular section with changes associated with the mechanical code to make sure you got to the right section. There was some previous section or previous amendment text stricken out as 1011.3 for illumination and 1011.4, which was completely eliminated for raised character and Braille exit signs. Those Houston amendments are no longer in the code. Let's see. In section 1016.2, egress through intervening spaces, there's a Houston amendment that identifies the specific sections associated with exit access through an enclosed elevator is permitted. Access to not less than one of the required exits shall be provided without travel through the enclosed lobby. Elevator lobbies required by section 3006.2, 307, or 308. So you have to go to those sections to see what it is that it's requiring, but there's a Houston amendment that allows that to happen. Stairway identification signs. Again, this is just another section in chapter 10 that is pointing to Appendix H of the Fire Code. It also includes an exception, and it has to do with stairway identification signs. We just are trying to correlate the building code with the fire code requirements so that they both have the same information in them. And someone familiar with just the building code or utilizing just the building code doesn't happen to miss the fire code requirements associated with these items. 1023.9.2 signs on occupancy side of stairway doors. This is a new City Houston amendment. Approved stairway identification signs having building official and code official approval shall be located on each floor level on the occupancy side of all interior vertical exit enclosures, regardless of height of the building. See Appendix H of the Fire Code. There is one exception, and this again is also includes the section for re-entry. It's identifying the re-entry sign requirements. Every 5th floor and the top floor. Okay, this is the City Houston amendments to Chapter 11, which basically says the existing provisions of Chapter 11 are not adopted and not replaced by the provisions below. So Chapter 11 is not adopted at all. Okay, there was a previous Houston Amendment 2012 in the 2015, I'm sorry, the 2012 in section 1203.2.2 exceptions. The following are exceptions to 1203.3. Those City Houston amendments were not brought forward. So the exceptions that were provided in the model code are now actually in the model code and can be taken advantage of. Let's see. Chapter 12. Interior environment. So we're talking about interior environment. 1207 scope. There was a City of Houston amendment in the previous code. That amendment was brought forward, which basically says when required by Chapter 9, Article 6, the city code, sound attenuation shall be provided. That still is a city code and must be adhered to. Chapter 14, exterior walls. There was previous City of Houston amendments that deleted flood resistant construction in 14036 and 7. those amendments were not brought forward. Chapter 15, roof assemblies and roof structures. There are City of Houston amendments for roof drainage that have been introduced into 1503.4 that instead, and the amendments basically scratch out the references in the model codes and point to the correct references that include City of Houston amendments that change these numbers. The same thing applies into the secondary drains or scuppers. There was some amendments that changed the numbers, and we had to change the numbers in these code sections to make sure you got to the right place. There was a previous City of Houston amendment in 1504.8 for aggregate, and that previous amendment was brought forward, and it basically eliminates